Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Magic Sandwich Show. I'm your host, JD Kane, and also a moderator. Not that that'll be very necessary because, well, we have at least one gentleman here and one guy just shut the fuck up. So tonight's show, hey Spackle, tonight's show is about morality. Specifically, a kind of a nonchalant, kind of off the cuff discussion between the a moral realist position and one of the moral anti-realist positions. And whatever the hell Mallory's wife believes in, some kind of crazy deist stuff. I don't know, it doesn't matter. But other than that, it should be an interesting discussion. I am on the moral nihilist position, but I am not really. I'm the moderator, so I don't get to really talk about that, which sucks. Anyway, a couple introductions. So, Mowdy, tell us a little about yourself.
My name's Chris Mowdy, and I'm 48 years old. I like to play bass, take long walks on the beach with my wife, Shanna, and that's pretty much me in a nutshell. But do you want to just like a basic intro, or do you want me to start talking about moral anti-realism?
Well, first, we have Sokka and Spack here. What the heck are you guys doing here?
Yeah, I'm Sock Account. I run a YouTube page and Instagram page giving makeup advice for pet owners to do on generally smaller, gerbils and hamsters and stuff. As well as I occasionally like to dive into these very deep conversations like. Sorry, what are we talking about again today?
It was Spackle. What's up? Looks like you'd be about to be attacked by a feather duster.
Yeah. So like sometimes I go outside and like this cuts the wind, but I am a moral realist and I am an ex-Christian. I recently deconverted about a year ago. I would probably call myself a deist at this point, though I really personally favor theism, but I can't prove theism. So, and I do believe that there are things called moral facts. I too play the bass, but not very well, not like Mowdy. And I live at the beach, so just kidding. So there's that.
So deist now. So you're basically you're functionally atheist. Is that how we put it?
Oh God. Thank you, Matt Slick.
Don't about to see Mowdy get punched in the arm here in a sec. Yeah, like I want to kill him. All right, so let's get started. So
I just think that like before we even started, there's like two more interesting conversations we should have, which is JD's moral nihilism, which just attack him for the next hour. And I want Shanna and Deidre to talk to find out if she's the right type of deist.
That's true. We could do like who's the right type of deist battle.
Oh boy,
give that a shot. Exciting.
And what about you, Max? What are you up to?
Yeah, that was my next. Max, what's up?
Well, let's see. Recently, I've went into teaching. I'm just completing my bachelor's of education, so I haven't been around this whole great debate community for a while. The real one, not the other one that shall not be named. I'm still a very devout Catholic. I go to mass where I live quite often. Still holding strong to the faith. For me, religion is something to have a sense of humor over. I quite enjoy it just for that. I also enjoy just the general Catholic culture on the internet as well. In terms of where I stand on the whole moral debate, I am a moral realist, and I do believe there are moral facts that I will try to defend here and this debate. And it's great to see everyone. I've known you all for a while, and it's great to be back, and I'll shut the up now. Can't even swear anymore.
Okay. Well, who wants to start off? Mowdy, what particular brand of moral anti-realism do you adhere to?
Well, I have to be honest. I don't know that they're I don't know of the brands of moral anti-realism that exist, because at a certain point this turns into nonsensical navel gazing to me. So as I understand it, and I could have this wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected about it, in having an open discussion with Max and Sokka and Holy. Moral realism is that, you know, there is an objective realism, objective facts, as Max had pointed to, and I'm painting in broad strokes. This is my bumper sticker version, whereas anti-realism is that morals are subjective. I approach this from a very pragmatic perspective, because the study of moral thinking and behavior falls at the doorstep of psychology, and to be studied, it almost needs to be, or it is easy to put it in the category of moral anti-realism, because if you were to look at things like developmental psychology, the way that we think morally changes over time. Also, the differences in genders has been noted. The difference between Kohlberg's model, which was mostly male-oriented, versus Gilligan's model, which is mostly female-oriented, a feminist approach to cognitive development and moral development. The fact that it changes, it kind of puts it in the subjective category. Also, moral relativism, which is the study of, you know, how morals and ethics are pursued in cultures. The fact that they are different between cultures, even though there are threads of continuity, kind of places it, for the way that I understand it, into the category of moral anti-realism. I'm less interested in questions of where morality comes from, but if I were asked that question, I would fall back on the fact that I'm charmed by Steven Pinker's proposal that we are born with a program that recognizes moral behavior, just like language, right? The same way that Chomsky posited that there was a language acquisition device that allows us to pay attention specifically to language and learn it at a very rapid rate that we wouldn't be able to within a certain window of opportunity, and that's usually 3 to 5 years old. He claims that morality is learned in the same way, and I'm very charmed by that. And lastly, I guess my position is also influenced by Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind book that he wrote. He lays out some principles, or he doesn't call them principles, he calls them something else. But I haven't read it in a while, so I don't have it at the tip of my fingers. But he does a really good assessment of the kinds of variables that go into morality. So that's why I am a moral anti-realist, because pragmatically, it seems to be the best position to have in order to study it from a psychological perspective. Again, happy to have my mind blown and opinion changed based on the conversation and dialogue.
All right, thanks, Mouty. Max, why are you a moral realist? What leads you to believe that moral facts exist?
Right. Well, I would say largely it is a religious influence. So my moral realism is mostly rooted in my religiosity, although there are plenty of moral realists who do not share that position. Michael Huemer, for example, is a robust defender of moral realism, although he does not hold to any form of theism that I'm at least aware of. I think even Sokka right here in this chat is a moral realist, and he does not believe in the existence of God. But with that out of the way, I would ground God. I would say that morals are, or moral facts are, duties that we have to God himself, and we are obliged to follow them because they come from an entity who is Ase, that is to say, he is the highest being in all of creation. He is not contingent or dependent upon anything else outside of him, but he is self-existent and self-sufficient. Now, how does that translate to a being who we have to obey and worship? Well, it follows from the basic fact that God, if nothing else, is that which none greater can exist. Going by the old Saint Anselm line, I'm not deriving God's existence based off of that, unlike Anselm does. I'll avoid the ontological argument here. But it seems to me that to be good onto yourself, that is to say, to be good for no other reason that you are your own goodness, that you're not good for some other end or means, but you are good unto yourself, I think that has to be emblematic of being that which none greater can exist. It seems if you're only great because you serve some kind of purpose or function or end, then that means you're somewhat limited or flawed. And because you can't have that, God has to be good unto himself. And of course, that means that there are certain things or reverences that we owe God because of this. And from there, we kind of develop a system of morality where one is to follow in God's commands. I believe things that come up in these theories of moral realism are things like the Euthyphro dilemma, which I'll be happy to address here, and mysteries such as, if morality is indeed grounded in God, how are we supposed to know that? And if we don't know that, how is it rational to obey that? I'll be happy to answer those questions here if you like, but that just defines where I'm coming from in this debate.
All right. And also, I wanted to interject because Shanna is sitting next to me, even though she's off camera. She has a moral anti-realist position that's slightly different than mine. And I think that would be worth it. You know, what's that? Okay. So she'll let you guys know how she feels about it after everyone else has gone.
All right. Let's go with hello, Converse contender. Let's go with. Hey, doing well. So Spackle, what is your take on moral realism?
I'm definitely not as eloquent as Max is, but my take on moral realism is that I think there's a natural cause for moral realism, that you can take a look and point to several civilizations and societies where they have similar rules and abide by similar moral facts and duties. And when you do that, you can point to the reasoning why these societies follow these moral duties. So you could take a look and say, oh, reduction of harm, for instance. And so the objective in these moral duties would be to flourish and to grow as a society, to grow as better people, as better humans. So these moral facts would transcend also through different communities, different societies, different nations, and we'd be striving towards these general facts. So an example would be most societies would condemn rape. Most societies would condemn murder as being, harmful to society, stealing harmful to society. And so most people would say that there's some sort of fact or duty to each other that we owe each other as a society to live by. And so I believe that just by how we interact in society, we live like we are believing in moral facts every day.
Well, would you agree that we can believe we're dealing in moral facts and act as though that's the case when morals actually aren't real?
That's possible, but it seems nonsensical. It seems like it's play acting, but yeah.
Maybe in a sense it is, but that's more my position. So Sokka, what about you?
Unfortunately to Max, it's been a few years since we talked. I've actually kind of moved away from the moral realist position. I recognize more as a moral anti-realist. And it's good to see that you still fall into the category of like natural law theory. I'm guessing, right? Judging from what you said.
Me? Yeah. I'd fall under.
I was going to say Max.
Max too. Yeah.
He loves his Aquinas.
Right. I'd actually say I moved away from the natural law position. Yeah, I've moved to something of a divine command theory with a few alterations to avoid some of the pitfalls of arbitrariness and capriciousness.
So my position is that one of the reasons why I moved to a more anti-realist position is that falls very similar in line with a lot of the stuff that Maudie said. I don't disagree that when we make any type of moral proclamations, we're representing these things as some type of propositional statement, and that these are things that we think are true. But what my problem is that when we're discussing morals or the rightness or wrongness or goodness of an action, is that I don't think that there's any intrinsic characteristics of the universe that exist that actually give any truth-making properties to those propositions. In that sense, I just don't think that moral realism is true.
So from what I understand, you said you moved away from the moral realist position and you're more into a position where, while moral facts are coherent, like they make sense, there's just no truth maker to them. Is that right? Your microphone broke up a little. Maybe I misheard.
Yeah, no, that's it.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
More in line with things like error theory.
Oh, okay, yeah. Error theory between itself and an incoherence view, I think, is the better option. So I think I'll meet you at least that far.
Yeah, I really like the idea that you can make moral propositions, yet they're all false.
Yeah, actually,
There's just some kind of presupposition failure, like they assume things that just are not true. So they all fail in some way.
JD, could I touch on a point you made about play acting? And this was also something Spackle brought up as well. To your point, and actually to defense of JD's point, one can consider it not so much as play acting, but just something of a social construct. So there's nothing grown into the universe about being a police officer. Like, it's not a natural property. The reason why we give certain people a uniform and badge and declare them police officer is because it helps us deter crime. And to the question, what is error theory? An error theorist is somebody who believes that moral propositions make sense. So it is wrong to stab people randomly. Like, the error theorist doesn't believe that that proposition can be true or false because there's nothing which makes it true or false. So if I was to say, it is wrong to stab people to death, the error theorist would say, that's false. If he says, is it okay to stab people to death? The error theorist would also say that too is false. Moral propositions can be true or false for the error theorist. Someone who is not an error theorist, but rather holds that moral propositions are not even coherent, holds that moral propositions aren't so much true or false, but rather that moral propositions are something like emotions. Like, that one position like that is called emotivism. So if I was to say it is wrong to stab people, if I'm an emotivist, I'll say, oh, when you say it's wrong to stab people, what you really mean is boo stabbing people, or yay stabbing people. Like, yay and boo is not a proposition. That's not true or false. That's really just an inflection upon how you perceive it. It doesn't actually tell us anything about the proposition, nor is it amenable to logic. I hope I described it well.
Yeah, pretty close.
All right.
Yeah, error theory is a cognitivist view of moral anti-realism. As far as I know, it's the only one. All the other ones are non-cognitivist, like emotivism or emotionalism.
There's another one where it's declarative, like when I say don't.
That one. Yeah.
We'll
go into it in a minute. Let me just go through error theory. Yeah. By the way, people have said my volume's low. Is it better now? Not too loud, not too soft.
It sounds good.
All right, good.
A little bit more. I need a little bit more sauce from you.
That's about as much sauce as I can give. It's already going into the yellow, going, you're loud.
All right.
So yeah, error theory is a cognitivist form of moral anti-realism, basically that you can form moral propositions, but they're all false. So when someone says, is raping babies for fun good? No. Is it bad? No. And that's where people freak out. He's like, well, it's got to be one of the other. No. They all assume that moral facts are a thing, and if they're not a thing, then the propositions are false. And that's kind of the gist of it. They all suffer from presupposition failure. They all presuppose that moral facts are a thing when they're not. And of course, there's arguments for why moral facts aren't real.
Well, it's not that it does. I mean, like, we agree that. Oh, sorry. I guess more along the lines would be that when you're making any type of a statement, like a propositional statement or declaration about the state of affairs, about reality, and you're saying that this is wrong, okay, or that this is bad, or anything like that, is that those things only become true due to the fact that there is some type of truth-making property of reality that you can point to. So, like, there exists some aspect of reality that makes those statements true. So, if I was to say that my car is red, okay, that statement is true because it corresponds to a fact of reality, mainly the color of my car in that case. And that statement is true because I have a car and it is red. Now, if I was to make the statement that my car is red, but cars didn't exist, or there was no part of reality that could correspond to that, that statement couldn't be true or false because there's just nothing that it would correspond to that can come to the conclusion on that. And so it's the same thing with like rightness or wrongness or bad or good, is that I don't think that those are, aspects of a reality that you could point to and say that because wrongness and badness and these concepts exist, that therefore these statements, these propositions about these moral propositions couldn't have a truth or falseness to them.
Just to add just to add something to that, there is good reason to prefer error theory over non-cognitivism for this reason. It seems to me that actually it seemed to Peter Geach, who was a British philosopher, that if something like non-cognitivism was true, let's say emotivism, where all don't stab, or all it is wrong to stab people just means is boo stabbing people. If that was the case, then moral statements would not be amenable to reason, but they are. So, for example, it is wrong to stab. If I was to say, for example, all people should not be stabbed. John is a person, therefore you should not stab John. Like, that is a perfectly coherent syllogism, but it doesn't make sense if it just boils down to boo and yay statements. It would just be boo all stabbing people, boo John. Boo John is a person, therefore boo not stabbing John. Like, that wouldn't make sense.
It's my preference. If you do not stab John, I wouldn't like that. I would not prefer that.
Well,
right? Like boo.
Right. But
yeah.
That's different, because when you say I'd prefer you not stab John, you're just basically speaking about your own psychological state. You're not necessarily committing yourself to a moral proposition when you say that.
Also, JD, there's a side chat and your producer's yelling at you in the side chat here, just so you know. Also,
not producer yelling at me.
Not all people on your panel have had a chance to present themselves.
Yeah, all right. That's right. Converse Contender, what is your position on morality?
Oh, don't worry about me. I'm nobody. I'm just kidding.
Okay, well, moving on. So the next person we have is I
would take the realist position. So I do think there are objective binding duties, and I guess maybe the easiest way to get into the conversation is because I only heard some of this. So I think maybe the easiest way to get into the differences is to maybe talk about a few things that I've heard so far. So with Maldi, he's coming from the psychological perspective, and that makes total sense to me, right? Like I applaud that. But like I'm in an ethics course right now, and one of the things that I'm understanding is that the psychological point of view on morality just tends to have it's just a descriptive. It's psychological is just the description of what humans do or why they act in such and such a way or why they have certain values. But I would say the whole conversation will probably, like the hinge of it will probably be around normative claims, which are basically just claims that should you do this or should you do that. And I think on the subjectivist or anti-realist position, there aren't these normative claims, at least not in a qualitative sense. And maybe somebody wants to respond to that, and we can start from there.
Well, since you mentioned me, I'd like to just jump on that a little bit. So thank you for the kudos about the psychological perspective. And I do agree that it is descriptive. And even though you're talking about normative or prescriptive claims about what you should and shouldn't do, while moral psychology doesn't give those normative values of morality, they study the moral reasoning of why people think you should or shouldn't do certain things. So the quickest example I could give is if you were to ask a 5-year-old if it's if you told a story to a 5-year-old about a man who needed medicine for his wife who was dying and he couldn't afford it, and he broke into the pharmacy to get it, would that be wrong? 5-year-olds would say yes, because their understanding and moral reasoning at that stage in life, at that developmental stage, is very rule oriented, and it's against the law to steal, right? So they're going to do the things that are good, that you should do in order to get reward, and avoid the things that you shouldn't do to avoid punishment. If you were to ask a 10-year-old that same question, you would get a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding or response based on their understanding, because of their different developmental stage, of the details of, well, it is also moral to save someone's life. And so, they would have a little bit more of a struggle and less of a concrete answer. All of that to say that I'm agreeing with you that moral psychology doesn't give the shoulds, but the ideas, the beliefs that humans have about what they should and shouldn't do is studied by psychology. So, and
Sure.
I don't think that you were arguing with that at all. It's just a weird point of clarification that I want.
Right, sure. Well, I guess I could start by, maybe for people who aren't familiar in the audience, like, I give an example. Like, there's a fallacious line of reasoning called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which basically just means like I'll give an example. Let's say you just took out the trash, and this is just like a descriptive mechanism. This is how psychologically it's describing how people think. So let's say you just took out the trash and you threw it away. Then you get back in and you can't find your keys. You immediately think, oh, I just threw away my keys. You think, because there's a correlation between what you just did and the fact you can't find your keys, that's the cause of you not being able to find your keys. So it's just describing the way that you think, right? But it would be fallacious, because maybe your keys are just, you happen to sit them on a counter in another room or something. So like, that's one thing is that I think psychology is really good at, is describing some of these mechanisms about how people think. But how should people think? That's different. Like, if I were to say, well, you shouldn't think that way because correlation doesn't always mean causation, and then you have to look elsewhere, because psychology it's not completely limited, but it does say like what humans, it describes about what humans do think and how they think, but not necessarily what they should. And so from there, I would just say that also there are going to be disagreements within moral realism, right? Because there's deontology, that's a perspective, and then there's more of a consequentialist view, and there are many views on that even moral realists will disagree with.
May I chime in on that?
Sure.
So there needs to be a distinction between what's called meta-ethics and normative ethics. Deontology and consequentialism are examples of what are called normative ethics. These are systems that tell us what we ought and ought not do, whether they're based off of actual moral facts or maybe just social constructions, and they're more or less based on emotions. Even if moral anti-realism was true, you could still be both a deontologist. You could still hold that we should decide what we ought and ought not do, based off of good norms and ideas. So, for example, John Rawls, he was a deontologist, but he also rejected moral realism. For him, to identify what we should and shouldn't do, we pretend we're behind a veil of ignorance. Let's pretend we don't know our gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, what have you. You're going to go to Earth, but you don't know where you're going to end up. You don't know what social class you're going to be a part of, any of that. And you have to decide the rules before you get there. Which rules would you decide? And this was a way of deciding on a fair system. For him, morality was more or less developing a system of fairness. And it was based on the idea that this idea of fairness wasn't arbitrary, but rather could be reasoned out. He didn't buy into moral realism, but that was his preference. And you could also be a consequentialist, because you could think, well, just because moral facts don't exist doesn't mean we can't maximize things. We like happiness. We like pleasure. We like the love of family. There are a lot of things human beings, all things considered equal, tend to prefer. Let's maximize those and minimize the things we don't like. So whether or not moral facts are true or not does not mean does not decide the debate whether or not we should be consequentialist or deontologists. The moral facts debate just concerns metaethics and whether or not these moral facts do or don't exist.
All right. Before we get too much further ahead, I believe Shanna wanted to express her views. Is she ready for that now?
Is she ready for that now?
I think I'm ready for that now.
All right. The floor is yours.
Oh goodness.
You just interrupted her bullet journal.
I'm doing
I'm putting you on the spot. Get in here.
So I don't think that morals are objective. I don't think that they're objective because I don't think there's very good reasons to think that they are. Because if we were any other kind of creature, our morals would be significantly different. And I think that that's fairly easy to demonstrate and to understand. So I think that that kind of gets rid of the, for me, objective morality is just no. And then when it comes to like good and bad or right or wrong, I lean more towards virtue ethics. I'm a virtue ethicist, right? So it's not really, there's a really good example that I read once, maybe it was in a video, I don't know, because sometimes I have a hard time giving like a pithy version of virtue ethics. But essentially, if you think of like Batman, killing the Joker, like a utilitarian view would be kill the Joker because it'll save more people. And then say like, you know, someone who believes that killing's wrong under all the circumstances would be like, no, don't kill Joker. There's a redemption arc in there somewhere. And a virtue ethicist would be like, or ethicist would be like, you know, well, is Batman the kind of person who wants to be a killer? What are the goals of Batman? And then that's how you determine whether or not the act was right or wrong, right? Based on the circumstances and the person and their virtues and their vices. I think that that's, for me, that's more important than, and works more in like a day-to-day life in a practical way than there's objective morals or there's subjective moral. Like, because I don't think there's very good arguments out there for objective morality.
And also with that, I would agree too that acting in such a way that you want others just to emulate that behavior as well. That there's value in that. That if you could if you present yourself in such a way that you know, people see you and they desire the same type of virtuous the kind of behavior that you have, like the same type of whatever that's that behavior that you want other people to emulate as well. So you become kind of like a beacon in that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. If that,
right.
If that was what that questiony tone meant at the end there.
Yeah, so, I guess. Sorry. There was actually one point I want to go up because I mean, there was something that Holy Spackle said early on, which was, you know, the first kind of like point of contention I'm really going to kind of bring up in this angle, I think.
Point of contention.
Point of contention.
Yeah, I knew I'd say off.
It was one of the things that you said, like one of the reasons why you appealed to like moral realist systems is you took a look at other cultures out there and you took a look at similarities that these cultures had, and because this certain similarity that different groups of people have come to, they've come to these similar conclusions about how people should act, that therefore that was indicative or good evidence to believe that there was some type of objective moral facts that did exist. But I'm wondering if you would give the same credence to any argument that you could point to where we can actually take a look at other cultures as well and see the drastic differences that they have when approaching certain, you know, moral problems. You know, a good example is how, you know, some cultures' views towards things like homosexuality, and the fact that there's this vast difference within these cultures. Wouldn't that also just be equal support of any idea that that moral realism would not be true?
That's a good question. So like, let's pick like, you know, a country where they go, you know, Uganda, and they think that, you know, homosexuality should be punishable by death. And by the way, I get hate messages because I'm the B in LGBT, and I've literally been messaged I should be stoned to death. Thank you very much. Great Calvinist guy. super duper. Jesus loves you. So anyway, what I would point to in those cases is why do they think that it would make their society flourish? Now they might point to, usually it's religious reasons, and they might point to like something to the degree of like, well, you know, I remember this one guy said homosexuality causes genocide, which was ridiculous, but just the fact that you can't procreate, therefore you're no good to society. But then I would point to that in all societies, we do need people who do not procreate or do not necessarily have their own children or adopt other children or support other families. And so like, I think we make a mistake in the modern day and age to say, hey, you know, these people are required to have the ability to procreate because families and structures have other supportive things. So when I look at a country that maybe has a different view on something like that versus another one, so like you compare the UK with Uganda, I would say which society flourishes more. Which society is more conducive to where humanity wants to be and would be more flourishing? And I don't think I'd pick Uganda out of the two. Maybe I'm an asshole.
But now you're shifting into kind of like a normative state of things too, where you start evaluating moral decisions based off of things like utility or consequence for those actions. You know, which I don't understand why you would need a moral realist position to endorse either of those positions. Like.
Why would I need a moral realist position to endorse either one of those positions? Well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, because like Max pointed out, like you could be, you don't have to be a moral realist to appeal to some type of consequentialism or utilitarianism, or not utilitarianism. Yeah, utilitarianism.
Gotcha. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that, Zaka. I don't have a comeback right now.
Could I answer Max Weber's question in the chat?
Can yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I just want to point out that there's a little mark on my checkboard there, Holy. Thank you. Yeah.
I mean,
I
don't necessarily. All right.
Yeah, but she has a TARDIS in her image, and so she's winning automatically there.
Oh, fair enough. Sorry, go ahead, Max.
Okay, let's see. Usually when I bring this up, every atheist states the obvious, but let's see if Max Weber decides. Let's see where Max Weber would go. It was wrong for God to genocide such and such a group of people. If there was ever a situation where I was defending the atrocities of the Bible, it seems everybody intuitively grasps that certain things that are in the Bible are fairly problematic for God to do. If someone bites the bullet, the response then isn't, oh, okay, fine, he bit the bullet. Isn't he ridiculous? It's, are you a monster? What are you doing? Are you crazy? Like, there's kind of this level of ostracism. It seems more obvious to me that skinning a baby alive for just to use its skin to drape over your lampshade, like, that's much more of an obvious fact to me than certain facts about the physical world I can empirically investigate. Like, they're at a certain point, like, the intuition for certain moral facts just really grab at you. Granted, there are a lot of moral facts we might be uncertain of, but I doubt you could find any culture around the globe who would endorse the pro-baby skinning policy. So we don't have rights, we privileges that can be drawn. That's another Max Weber thing. I actually agree with Max on that one. I don't really buy into the whole rights idea of morality. I don't believe that's how you can properly have a normative discourse. But you don't need rights to be a moral realist. Alistair McIntyre is a virtue ethicist who's a moral realist, but thinks that rights are stupid. And frankly, I don't disagree with him. So yeah.
Max, are you saying you don't believe in moral facts? I might have misunderstood you.
Oh no! I believe in moral facts. I just don't believe that rights are a coherent concept or idea. Like like in this whole human beings have an inherent set of rights that we could derive just through rational investigation. That's not my own perspective. I think that I think that the only person who inherently has any right is God, the right to be worshipped, and morality is thereafter just dictated by him. At least most moral norms are.
Gotcha. So maybe one of the people who don't take the realist position might want to speak to the example that he gave to answer the question about a moral fact, which was what was it, skinning a baby alive, I think.
I was more creative, skinning a baby
Sure.
alive to use its skin to drape over your lampshade, but just
Gotcha,
skinning
okay.
babies alive is fine by
Right,
me.
more trivial, sure.
I'm surprised you didn't use the jizzing one. Jesus.
Yeah,
you know what?
Forgot about that.
You know, I don't think that we need within these discussions. We always go to these really weird places. We just call it Act X. You know, like just imagine Act X as the most reprehensible thing you could think of, and we'll just go with that.
Yeah, I mean, this gives me some ideas for my interior decorating. I mean, I was using baby seal skin for my lampshades, but apparently, well, just good old fashioned human babies make an excellent lampshade. I have to look.
Yeah, I was gonna invoke Godwin's law, but
well, because I know that
actually, you know, Hitler's skin would also make a good lampshade. I'm sure.
Because we're going to go. Because the challenge to Max, and I mean he put this out there at the beginning of the conversation, was that so we're going to naturally follow this down, especially if you're grounding this in some type of well, I'm not sure how you grounded it in God. I didn't hear specifically how you did, but eventually we're going to get down to the problem of the Euthyphro dilemma, which you said that you're willing to address that, and I'm curious of how it is that you're going to do that now.
Sure. So the Euthyphro dilemma, just to rephrase it, it's been going around for some time, but why not one more? Okay, so is something good because God commands it, or does God command something because it is good? Usually the move most apologists make is just to try to break the horns and say, God commands it. God doesn't command it because it's good, nor does he command it because, nor is it good because he commands it, but rather goodness is a reflection of God's nature, something like that. And kind of makes the whole notion trivial because you're just defining goodness as God and working from there. It becomes tautological at that point. So what I usually do is go with, is try to break the horn a little, but not go all the way. So I usually start off like I did earlier with God is that which none greater can exist. If he's nothing else, he has aseity. So if we start off there, it's definitional, sure, but it's something I believe that can be reached through natural theology. I won't do that here, but let's just go with it. After that, God is that which none greater can exist. Now, one can be good in two ways. One can have good in the sense of good for something. So a hammer is good in terms of its function of nailing nails. A hammer is much better than a rock, for example. But that's a good in the sense of, fulfilling a function or an end. And basically anything can have this. Even bad things might have some utility that you can utilize, even if it's very small and fragmented. If God only had that, then there would be some kind of limit to how great he is. However, one can be great in and of itself. Something can be great in and of itself, categorically good. Good not because it fulfills any objective, but good unto itself. That seems to be the greatest good. If God only had the first one, there would be yet another being greater than him, and it's not really the same entity which I'm referencing. So I would say that God is inherently good in and of himself, and that's where we start at the beginning. Now, God has certain other qualities that make him that which none greater can exist. Another one of these is, rather than knowing the truth, he is the source of all truth, or he is truth itself, which kind of makes it impossible for God to lie. Not because there's something outside of him that compels him not to lie, but rather because he's truth itself, it makes no logical sense to therefore say there's some kind of lie possible from him. And then this is where I kind of veer off from other apologists who might just try to stay in the middle lane. I would say anything else, God could basically will. The only difference is it's not arbitrary because God has a specific purpose for any and all of his commandments. So even though God might not have categorical reasons for preferring one command over another command, he might have a practical reason or a practical end for a commandment.
Just for a sec, when you mentioned commandments, you mean just the rather famous 10, or all the commandments that are in the Old Testament?
By commandment,
so, I think.
Right. Okay. By any command, I mean any moral proposition. So it might not just be limited to revelation, and in fact, some revelation. In fact, I'd say that some of the commands no longer apply because they've been abrogated, of course. But just to move on from there. So actually, just to give an example, in the Old Testament, God commanded that it was okay for men to have multiple wives. However, in the New Covenant, one man, one wife. Why is that? Well, there's no categorical reason for it, but it doesn't mean God doesn't have any practical reason for it. It's a sign and symbol of the fact that Christ has one spouse, which is the church. So marriage, therefore, that moral command creates marriage, which itself fulfills the quality of symbolizing Christ's relationship to the church. So God might have prudential reasons for preferring a command. And that command doesn't become obligatory until he makes the commandments. So that's how I would get around the Euthyphro dilemma. Would you see any objection with that? At least any kind of glaring one?
Well, I mean, the first one is that when you define God as like the greatness of these attributes there, I mean, we can present something like Stephen Law's evil God problem. Okay. That why is it that something that has the greatest of all attributes, that you chose one of those attributes to be, goodness? I mean, what happens if the greatest of all, is something that is just perfectly malicious? Something that is, in that case, that seems like a perfectly, that if such a God existed. And same thing with the Christian God as you describe it in the world that we live in, those worlds would be completely identical. And then, your goodness would have to be defined by the negative attributes of this God.
Right. So let's go with the Stephen Law objection. Let's say maliciousness was one of these greater properties for the sake of argument. It seems to me that it's greater to be, you are a more malicious entity if you are malicious not against others, but also yourself. And if you're malicious against yourself and you're actually doing something, then you're engaging in self-harm or self-destruction. In which case, we would say that it isn't greater to have maliciousness because it is self-destructive. A God that lacks maliciousness and in fact isn't malicious but is benevolent to himself and others is actually the greater being. So I would say that the problem with Stephen Law's objection is an evil God strikes me as incoherent.
So you think that a greatest being could not, it has to be malicious to itself as well. Right. But in the same sense, this greatest being from your view would have to be completely benevolent to itself. Mm-hmm. So the fact that but then we bring into all the aspects of Christian theology now, mm-hmm. where this such a creature, such a being of perfect goodness, who according to Scripture, it cannot be in the vicinity of sin, but yet is because he's omnipresent, mm-hmm. is putting himself into a position of suffering all the time that he doesn't need to be in. And if he's completely benevolent, even to himself, he would not put himself into a position where there would be any sin around him at all. In fact, he would have to put forth the universe where he could not be in the presence, because of his omnipresence, could not be surrounded by sin anywhere.
Mm-hmm. All right. So
yeah.
Oh, continue. Oh, all right. So that has a couple of responses. One is just to say that evil or sin doesn't really have an ontology, but rather is something like coldness. Coldness also lacks an ontology. It's just parasitic on heat. So God being in the presence, when God is in the presence of sin, it's not so much that when he closes in on, when he's in the vicinity of sin, sin hurts him, but rather whenever he's present around sin, he dispels it. And in fact, God only allows sin insofar as it brings about some greater good, which he will then dispel anyway. And God's own suffering in the incarnation is not against his divine attribute or nature, but is only against his human nature. So God, qua his humanity, can be around evil and suffer, but it doesn't therefore affect God's divinity.
Okay. Who else wants to? Anyone else want to chime in? Also, I have a. If not, I have a question for the crowd.
Yeah. Well, I guess I could add some, but I don't want to kind of. I don't. I know Monty hadn't really said anything in a while, but maybe I'll add one thing, and we can kind of
Say something?
just discuss this.
No.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So, I guess what I'm wondering is, one of like Craig and others used to use this argument from an atheist philosopher, Louise Anthony, which I really respect, and I think Louise Anthony, she put, I believe, I'm just off the top of my head, I believe she said, any argument for moral skepticism will be less. I don't think she said intuitive. She said it will be built on less sturdy, I think, premises than any built based on moral relativism. I mean, moral ontological morals. So basically, she's just saying, like, if you run a parallel argument between moral objectives and a moral relativism or subjectivism, this moral skepticism claim will be built on less she said less obvious premises. And so, like, for example, if I were like to evoke Godwin's law and say something like, well, because Craig used to use this example too, like if the Nazis would have won World War II and killed off or brainwashed everybody that they disagreed with to believe that gassing Jews was the correct or the right thing to do, would it then be the right thing to do because everybody in the world believes that it is? And so I think that's what she meant by that, is that it seems like it's built on a less obvious, the premises are less obvious. And therefore, I think that the objectivism, like the objective view, does seem to me to at least be, if not a better argument, at least a more intuitive position.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just, and if anybody wanted to, I mean, I'm willing to have my view changed on that, obviously, but go ahead.
Well, I'll address that, but I think actually, Chris, did you want to say something first?
No.
Okay, so the issue with that is that it just becomes like a kind of appeal to consequence. I mean, like if you're thinking like that, you're building the structure that has, that there's no grounding that you can kind of point to, that there's nothing really kind of objective you can point to. That just might be the case. That just might be the case. Unfortunately, as undesirable as that might be, how much you want an idea to be true doesn't really affect how true that action is going to be. So you could be like an error theorist, or like an anti-realist, that follows the same type of idea as error theorist, where to talk of morals, it doesn't really make sense. Is that there's no such thing as like a moral, like morals. This should not even really come into the conversation, because they're not actually a thing. And but yet they're so ingrained in our language that when we speak about these certain things that we view as desirable or with utility or the consequences of certain actions, that this just becomes the linguistic structure that we'd like to phrase these things in. It makes sense to say stealing is wrong, and you could be an error theorist or an anti-realist and still utter that statement, and that just becomes a position of moral fictionalism, which is that we agree that this is a fiction, but it's a useful fiction, and that because we can agree that it's a useful fiction, we're just going to keep on using kind of like the linguistic standards that are set forth by the type of system that you want, because it's desirable that way. But like I said, that doesn't really endorse that system as being more likely the case than not.
Right, but I think, Max, correct me if I'm wrong here, but error theory is a moral skepticism theory. It is classified under that. So her argument actually stated that any argument from moral skepticism will have less obvious premises than an objective basis. So that would be encompassed in that.
Right. So, from what I understand of her argument, I don't think it's an appeal to consequence. I think it's more of a Morean shift. So, G.E. Moore was famous for kind of refuting the whole "is the external world real" philosophical idea. So, it's like this extreme solipsism. So, here is the proposition: the external world. If the external world doesn't exist, then this is not my right hand and this is not my left hand. The external this is my right hand and this is my left hand, therefore the external world does exist. Now, of course, it might seem like Moore is begging the question here and he just wants his hands to be real. But really what Moore is saying is, look, it's more obvious to me that my hands are in front of me. These are my hands than some philosopher just shooing away the external world. Like, whatever argument a philosopher can make that the external world doesn't exist or we're minds in a vad, they are not going to be as convincing to us as these hands in front of me do exist. So this is what I kind of take her argument as. Would you say that's a fair way of phrasing it?
Yeah, so that's how I take it as well, because as Craig mentions after that, he'll typically say something like, in any argument, like for example, properly basic beliefs, he'll say, like, any argument you can run against these beliefs, I can run a parallel argument against the external world being the case, for example. So yeah, that's the way I took it as well. So then I guess the question would be, like, if this does seem right, if it even on subjectivism, it makes me wonder, like, when you have these well, I guess you could just appeal to your personal preferences, but I don't know. I guess do you guys have any bone to pick with that argument?
Well, I guess this is where you could actually start bringing in what I was saying about what Holy Spackle put forward earlier, is that I find that there is very few examples. Oh, shoot. My phone's ringing. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
My rebuttal is suck a dick, Sokka.
Yeah, 1 second. Sorry, I'll have to reply in a second.
So who wants to take a shot
it's a throwback.
Yeah. Who wants to take a shot at the comment that was just up? Who can define moral skepticism for me?
So
I take more.
Go ahead.
Besides Max.
So it basically, there are a few different, I guess you would say, sectors maybe of moral skepticism, and it basically says that, like, no one can have moral knowledge or some claim to that effect. It's almost like an agnostic view in what we would call the Great Debate community, but it's basically that there aren't, because of a moral claim, or what we would consider a moral claim, it doesn't entail that therefore there are moral facts or any moral knowledge from that. And there are obviously different types, right? So I think that there are, in fact, moral skeptics that would accept. I think they're all opposed to moral realism, though. Is that correct, Max?
By moral skeptic, I just use that as kind of an umbrella term for people who just don't think moral facts exist, or are not convinced moral facts exist. So, like, as an agnostic, yeah.
Like, they don't think it. So not just that. Well, yeah. I mean, I guess that's one way to put it, is that they don't, but that you can't have knowledge of moral facts, or of let's say an actual immoral thing.
The idea of, like, moral knowledge is kind of nonsense. Like, there are facts out there that you can know, and know that you know that you know what you know is nonsense. That's a part of it too.
Yeah, actually, what Jen brings up is a solid point. I don't think we've distinguished between moral ontology and moral epistemology. Moral ontology is basically what you take moral facts to be.
Oh, I'm sorry, my mic's
Mic's still on.
Sorry about that. It's getting
No, the correct response is shut the fuck up, Max.
Ouch. What moral facts? What you consider
Everybody
moral facts?
consult your dictionaries and you'll get what Max is saying.
Moral ontology means this is what I think a moral fact is. So colors. What are colors? Well, the ontology of a color is it's some kind of wavelength. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but basically it's like that. Moral knowledge is
These
how
are
do
called
we know moral facts
colorologists.
exist?
I think they're colorologists.
Colorologists. Yeah, I think my friend Mary is one of them. Only a few people would have gotten that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Swing and a miss, Max. Swing and a miss.
It's interesting. From what I'm looking up about moral skepticism, it could actually fit into both realist and anti-realist categories. It has to do with whether in some cases, it has to do with whether you know that you know. You might know it, but you don't know that you know it, in which case you're skeptical about it. Like, you can never say that you're sure. But that doesn't mean the moral fact isn't there, just that you can't be sure that you hold one. So there are quite a few varieties of it. It seems overly complicated, to be honest. It sounds simple, but apparently it's not.
Yeah, and okay, so I guess I could maybe get this conversation rolling in maybe a more a bigger or broader way. So I would just say that I have a lot of people disagree with me on my conception. Like I take a deontological view, right? I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, right? But that's the view that I take, and it basically says that that moral facts are not based on consequences, but rather on like a set of rules, for example. And then to explain the ontology and the epistemology, one might ask, okay, well, there's these set of rules. How can we know what is one of these rules? That would be the epistemological claim. But like, how are these actual moral? That would be the ontological question. So maybe that if somebody was wondering, and then the moral skeptic would say like, well, no, it's not a fact. Like none of those are something that an objective thing in reality that you can know, regardless of if it's the case or not. Like it might actually be the case, but you can't know it. And maybe somebody wants to criticize my view or something. I don't know. Maybe that'll take us into it.
I don't necessarily want to criticize your view, and I just want to jump on something Max just said and something that somebody in the side chat. Let's get the people in the side chat a little more involved. So theoretically, fantastic name, is the person that I'm going to be addressing after I address Max. He said that he's not a scientist. Me neither, but I do play one on TV and in my lab. You see? Like that? So tackling this from a potential scientific perspective, and I might be changing channels a little bit on this. Excuse me. That wasn't the question I was going to address, but that's also a good question. So this will tie together. Please bear with me. I'll try to be as pithy as I can. Earlier, Theo, and I'll just pretend that it's a real name, Theo, as a first name. Theo was talking about natural laws and natural rights, and I kind of busted his chops, and I was like, no, that's a myth that humans make up based on the naturalistic fallacy, and he, or that people should be treated equal. I think that was one of the things. If you can find that and bring it up, I'd like to address it. But it brought to mind for me the book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humans* by someone whose name I can barely pronounce. Let's see if I can find it real quick. I put a Wikipedia page in the side chat for it. It is Yuval Noah Harari is the author. And as I am charmed by Pinker and as I am charmed by Haidt, I am also charmed by this author because the way that he describes it is from an evolutionary perspective. And in thinking of it from a morals and ethical behavior, from the evolutionary perspective, from what I get out of it is it's a process. It's not a thing. And since it's not a thing, it can't be a fact, right? It's not a noun, it's a verb, but we apply this label on it called morals. So I just want to read something that I pulled up real quick, because the example that the author gives is he kind of picks apart the first statement in the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with natural unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, in the book, he tears that apart piece by piece. And this isn't the book, but it's a review of it. And he's pretty much saying the founding fathers got it wrong. The only place where such universal principles exist is in the imagination. So that's why he calls everything a myth. Like, it doesn't have to, you don't have to call it an ideology or a religion, or let me rephrase that. You don't have to call it a religion or a myth. You could just call it an ideology. And just let me finish up this little bit, and then I'll open it up to anyone who wants to comment. His arguments are, like outlined, like people were not created. They evolved, and they certainly did not evolve to be equal. The Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul, and that all souls are equal before God. However, if we don't believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, and souls, what does it mean that all people are equal? And the reason why I'm bringing up is because the thing that Theo said had to do with humans have the right to be treated equally, and that's what. And I'm not throwing Theo under the bus. I would be curious to know what his or her take on this is. Evolution is based on difference, not equality. Neither is there a creator who endows anything. There is only a blind evolutionary process devoid of any purpose. There are no such things as rights in biology. There are only organs, abilities, and characteristics. I think that's charming as fuck, especially within a discussion about morality and ethics. I open this up to the floor.
It's funny. Me and Hogtie Champ are both fans of Sovereign Citizen videos, and we had a discussion about this earlier. Something similar along those lines, and that rights are these things that are that we kind of agree to. They're kind of guaranteed to us by the society that we live in. They're not given to us. They're not innate. There's nothing that about them that is like comes from any type of mystical entity or anything like that. Rights, as we kind of typically understand them, if you want to look at them in the most cynical way, are just the guarantees. When we talk about the specific rights we generally talk about are the guarantees from whatever hierarchical or governing body that's out there that will not be taken away. Because we have rights taken away all the time. We agree to this, within any type of social contract, that you have more rights taken away from you than you have that are guaranteed by the government. The right for me to go out and kill my neighbor is a right that I've given up, and it's a right that I've gladly given up, for the chance of it being reciprocated back onto me. So we have no problem, surrendering certain rights to whatever kind of governing body is out there. But we speak so fondly of these other rights because these are the things that we believe are going to be guaranteed to us by whatever sovereign we're kind of like talking about here, that will never be taken away, and that's why we value them so much.
I am finding it quite fascinating how much I actually end up agreeing with the moral anti-realist side on this one, despite myself being a moral realist of a theistic persuasion. Yeah, I would agree, one, with Haidt's idea that a lot of what Western ideas and concepts of morality do have their metaphysical presuppositions rooted in Christianity. And that's something Haidt realizes, and that's actually something philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche realized. Like, if you're going to get rid of Christianity and make things more secular, you have to find something else to actually, I shouldn't say ground rights, but you have to have some other philosophy of understanding of reciprocation, having a government, things of that nature as well. And also, yeah, rights are fairly hierarchical too. This is why moral facts make more sense on theism. It's because theism is a hierarchical system. It forces that onto the universe, whereas under naturalism, where we all originate not through hierarchy, but rather from the bottom up through random processes, or deterministic processes, but just little bits of matter functioning through the laws of physics.
Which is
Mac's
amazing.
still the hangout.
So high five to the moral anti-realists in here.
I just want to challenge that, but I
ahead.
feel like it's off topic. Like to have a theist say that they don't care about human rights, or like human rights aren't a thing, is kind of interesting to me. Because that means that you definitely adhering to like this kingdom that God is a king and you're a kingdom, and you are the potter and he is the clay, and you must do whatever he does and says, and whatever God calls good is good, because God is divine in his nature, and that's who he is. Why? Because God told you he was. And it seems like it's kind of a ball of, I don't know. It seems like it's a ball of if then, the other, like it's my question would be, as a theist, not believing that people actually have rights, I guess for me, wouldn't you appeal to like a Christian humanist, for instance? A Christian humanist would appeal, like Mr. Rogers would appeal to something like the Imago Dei, then, because God created you in his image and there's value in your image, that because of that, you might have some rights actually afforded to you because of who you are in the kingdom. You don't even subscribe to that? Like there's no kind of rights?
First off, let's not pretend that speaking of rights is an automatic guarantor of being free from persecution and oppression. In fact, rights talks can actually make you susceptible to government persecution. In the case of Native Americans, it was argued that the reason the government had a right to take away their property was because natives, because they didn't have private property, couldn't even claim the land. So it wasn't even theft to begin with. That was not only Ayn Rand's form of thinking, but it was something even ruled on in Canadian and American court systems, and that goes back all the way to John Locke. So I'm not beholden to rights being as all great as people portray them to be, A. B, just God is actually, I believe that when God thinks of what he wills or commands to do, he doesn't do it arbitrarily or capriciously. He himself has one goal or end, which is the praise of human beings and bring them into, which is getting human beings into the kingdom, praising him for all of eternity, and coming to his idealistic relationship, something that kind of reflects his own personal relationship in the Trinity itself. In the Trinity, it's three figures who love each other for all eternity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he wants to extend that kind of relationship to created beings as well. And from there, he thinks, which are the commandments that are going to best accomplish that end? And I might not know why he picks any and every commandment, but I trust his judgment. That's fair enough. Some things are a little beyond me. And some things are a little beyond humans entirely. Does this mean I have license to think that God can do just about anything? No, I can be fairly critical of Scripture and the text. And in those circumstances, when I think of Calvinists or others who might bite the bullet on biblical genocide, I have my own response that I'm quite content with, and I don't think that one is also committed to just seeing God as a moral monster just because one blindly accepts. And God blindly doing things just because one is willing to accept that his will is the grounding of most, or if not a majority, of all moral facts. And it's not because God tells me that I believe he's the source of morality. I think I have a reasonable justification from reflecting upon what God's nature is, being that which none greater can exist. So that's how I would respond to all those points.
Well,
Sorry,
I do
there's
kind
a
of
lot.
sympathize. I do kind of sympathize with Spackle on this. And I'm not sure if I got quite the answer out of that. Like, it does seem that if, like the text of the biblical scripture, for example, if it does seem that if God created people with this innate image of God, or image bearers, some people like Heiser point out that it maybe should be translated as the image of God, as a representative, for example.
Right.
In that sense, it does kind of question whether people would have these innate rights on that view, not due to some other consequential
Mhm.
point, but rather in and of itself as innate. Do you get where she's coming from with that?
Right, because God is. Oh, I see. Because we are made in the image of God, therefore it would follow that we also have some kind of innate qualities that God Himself has. Is
Yeah,
that the
kind of
point?
kind of
Right.
the claim that Christ made, that like the least of what you do to these people, you also do to me. That kind of
Right. And so I was
proposition.
wondering how in the world you can square that, because I think Christian humanism has a huge seed in Catholicism, big time, like with the, so my question is, how do you square people just don't have rights? It's not a thing with that. And I guess wasn't clear, but Converse is actually pointing it, and that's why I was wondering. It's a very nitty gritty thing, and it's definitely a theist kind of thing. But I was just wondering how you could just kind of throw out rights, like that's all.
Oh, okay. So when I conceive of rights, I conceive of something which is inherent to our humanity. But I don't really consider rights ultimately grounded in. But I don't really consider moral facts ultimately grounded in our humanity. Like someone can be, I don't know, and someone could be an Aristotelian. Someone can say that there is, or someone could say there is no God, but there is a human nature, and that grounds rights, and it kind of circumvents any notion or need of God anyway. Ultimately, it comes from the intellect and will of God. Like that is where commandments are grounded. That is where obligations and moral duties are grounded. If I think that ultimately rights, if we can have some kind of discourse on them, is something that's ultimately grounded in God, and it's only derivative in humans. And that's why I shy away from rights talks. It just doesn't seem to. It just seems to have all these weird entanglements for me.
Sure. And while okay, so I kind of want to get past the rights talk, if unless Monty or Soccer or anybody wants to add to that before we do. You guys good?
Do all the anti-realists say, rights not a thing? That's pretty much across the board, right?
Well, I'm not saying that they're not a thing. I think that, of course, obviously rights are a thing. It's just that they're not an innate thing. They're a thing that, like I said, yeah.
Yeah, they're a pretend thing for playing.
They're not like some objective right. They're just something that we.
What Shanna said. They're a pretend thing.
We're LARPing that it's real. Okay, got it.
Right.
So with that, if like we're done with the rights talk, I did have a question for Max. Just like, I know this is supposed to be like realism versus anti-realism maybe, but like just like a question, do you take a consequentialist view, or do you take a, like, what's your view
on normative ethics?
Right.
Okay. Actually, I think I would side with the virtue ethicists on this one. I think the way we know things are right and wrong is because they have certain moral exemplars, and we tend to follow them. And, as a Catholic, actually, one of the things that gravitates me to the church is the fact that the saints kind of act as a family, and ultimately you get your ultimate human exemplar in Christ, who is also fully God. And usually by following these people, their examples, their narratives, and their stories, you kind of have a sense or idea of how to act. And this stems from our social emotions, like admiration. Like you just have this intensive pulse to follow them, and you do. And there are narratives like from all over the world, and common ideas, tropes, arcs that we can assess and analyze and say, but these people did this in these countries. It seems like the thing to follow. And some might say, well, even that is subjective. True, but while you might have mixes of bad qualities and good qualities in heroes, it stands to reason that as you dissect and look at all of them, you're better able to weed out which virtues and don't really translate that well, and which ones do. And the virtues that actually are universal are actually the ones we should be more keen on following, and over time we just detract from the ones which we shouldn't be following.
So maybe one more question, then I'll
Mhm.
try and shut up. But
Sure.
so with virtue ethics, can you like help me understand the difference between that and a consequentialist view? Because in a sense, virtue ethics are kind of built into looking at the consequences of an action, right?
Um, no, so a consequentialist is somebody who tries to maximize some kind of end by simply pointing to the fact that um, by doing X, we're going to maximize some Y, like happiness, for example. Therefore, we
Sure.
should do that. Whereas the virtue theorists would say something along the lines of, we should do what the virtuous person would do. Like that is what we should do, what the virtuous person would do. And who is the virtuous person? I would say that the virtuous person is somebody um, who grabs our admiration. And of course, we could assess who grabs our admiration by just doing a cross-cultural assessment, by looking into the myths, norms, and narratives of our histories, religions, mythologies, all of that. And I think that would actually do a good job of helping us out with that end.
Okay, I can see the distinction you make, but from my like understanding that consequentialism is just that something morality is based off the consequences of an action, and thus in virtue ethics it seems like it's kind of based off the same thing. But I can see the distinction you made though. In
Think of it like this: consequences are based off the consequentialism. Is the good is based off the consequence of an action. Virtue theory, goodness should be based off of the character of a person or peoples.
right, but the character is dependent on the consequences, right?
No, not on the consequences.
It's not.
So for me, I emphasized admiration. So it's based upon who grabs human admiration. And admiration is not something we just give away subjectively. Like one other thing I'd point out is certain emotions of ours are actually epistemic. They actually tell us something about the world. If there are sometimes by reflecting on your emotions, you could actually assess whether or not someone's behavior is acceptable or unacceptable, whether or not someone is, and that's because we evolved these emotions to do just that. That's why they stay around. Maybe I'm completely wrong. Mounty could probably speak on the origin of emotions better than I can, but I think that they have a lot of epistemic value in that. So that's why I kind of drift towards admiration as being a good way of helping us determine who the virtuous person is.
Right, like the consequences aren't necessarily the thing that matters most with respects to virtue ethics, because like in the scenario with Batman, Joker dies either way. The consequence is the same. But what were the intentions? What is the character of the person who did the killing? Right? If it was the Penguin, well, his character is not very virtuous and his intentions weren't great. But if it was Batman, it's different. What's the characteristics of Batman? Batman does not want to be the kind of person who's out killing, right? The consequence is the same. Joker's fucking dead. Am I allowed to say that? Oh, well, it happened. Joker's dead.
It's a family show, bitch.
Oh.
Sure. So that makes sense. I mean, I guess so. I know IP Inspired Philosophy, for instance, is he takes the virtue ethicist point of view. I guess. See, I just looked up virtue ethics to see like where would I have got that idea from, and it does say that it's based off the character or sense of honesty. But it also says virtue ethicists discuss the nature and definition of virtues and their other related problems, which focuses on the consequences of an action. So it could just be that I got some that there's something there that I haven't yet delineated. So
my understanding is a virtuous person might say, not only will they weigh the consequences of an action, but what does that action say about you? And what does that mean about your character? Am I incorrect in thinking that?
No, I think that's a fair representation.
Okay, it's not solely based on the consequences.
Right, like a lot of like morality that's only based on like right or wrong, good, bad, what happened, consequent. Like that's forgive me, a very juvenile way of looking at morality, in my view. And from the virtue ethicist position, you take all of these things into consideration. You think about the character of the person, what the consequences mean. You know, you weigh the consequences between, you know, action or not action, and what your intentions are and what you're going to do after that. There's always the then what question and the analysis. And like, there's just a lot more to it than is it right or is it wrong?
Exactly, and something just to add to that, someone can have great character despite the fact that the consequences go awry. So, for instance, let's say someone breaks into my house and says that they will kill me and my loved one unless I just kill them. So in the first case, he's the one just killing two people. In the second case, I get to live, but I have to live with the fact that I killed the love of my life. Let's say in this particular scenario, I look at my loved one, we decide, yeah, we're just not going to do this at all. We'd both rather die than play into your sick game. In terms of the consequences, more people died than needed to. But in terms of, you know, the exemplification of character, two people dying a hero seems to be a better character virtue than one person living knowing that he killed his spouse, even if that spouse, even if he agreed to it and he had to live the rest of his life with that consequence. So that's one thought experiment I would give to help delineate the two.
Okay, appreciate that. Like I understand. I do get where you're coming from. I mean, I guess one might could argue that the consequence wasn't. I guess it was the best that you could have got out of that situation, maybe. But yeah, so maybe we can move past that. I didn't want to, you know, harp on that. Just for my information, I was kind of wondering. But Monty or Sokka, is there anything you guys want to add to this so far?
Well, first, I'm just going to bust your chops a little bit. It's pronounced Mowdy, although it's a valiant effort that you keep trying.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Maddie?
Mowdy. Just howdy.
Mowdy, gotcha.
Mowdy with an M. Mowdy for life. Those are my gang symbols.
So that you're not in a game.
Nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
Also, when you put up the L like that usually means something else than life.
And the only other thing I want to add is a funk bass solo.
No, it only counts if you actually have the guitar there with you. That's what it says.
Just listen to this. I'll dare do it.
Nice.
Nice. Service announcement about psychology. The 5 stages of life are actually a myth.
Okay. I think we'll.
That's actually Maxwell's Murder has an objectively better bass solo than that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're familiar with Rancid's Maxwell's Murder.
Yeah, there are no bass solo facts.
Nice.
Disagree.
Right. Anyone else have something more they want to add? I think we're going to wrap things up.
Can we spend at least the next 10 minutes bashing JD for his moral nihilism?
Really? Wow. Did Sokka jump out?
It's normal for JD to have indefensible positions.
Well, I mean, nothing as bad as deism, but, you know, I try.
Oh, my God.
I'm surprised nobody...
You can muster one good argument against deism if I offered you 10 grand to do it.
I'm surprised nobody...
It's more like there are no good arguments for deism. That's kind of the problem.
All right, I'm surprised nobody took issue with my deontological view. I'm used to getting so much crap about it. So,
How dare you?
welcome, Justin.
Hey. Well, I think it's just like, I mean, in all fairness, we're just the deontology. I mean, when that's getting into the realm of the normative side of things again, and it's like, you know, just for the nature of the discussion there.
Yeah,
I don't really understand. So, are you a moral realist or moral anti-realist? I think I maybe missed that.
Yeah, I'm a realist.
Okay. You know, with your viewpoint. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I'm curious. Just more of a secondary question. Is it possible to be a theist and an anti-realist with morality? Maybe not
Yes.
possible. Are there any would be a better actually way, but I can see how it could be theoretically possible. But does anyone here know of a
Sure. I
theist who
guess
is
the
also an
deist.
anti-realist?
Yeah, I'm sure
Well-
deists could be anti-realist.
Yeah, I mean, like for example, like well, and I mean, I think Max or Spack or Converse can disagree with me or not, but it depends. I think also on if you're a divine command theorist and what horn of the Euthyphro dilemma you throw yourself upon. I mean, if you are willing just to simply say that when we talk about moral actions, you know, the rightness and wrongness of moral actions, we were actually describing what it is that a god would do in those situations, and that in that case, I think that there a good argument can be made that that system there would be more of an anti-realist system because it would start falling in, you know, more in line with there's something like a ideal observer theory, which would also be anti-realist. That there's these things these things aren't necessarily true; they just become descriptive. These propositions on moral facts aren't necessarily true or anything; they don't actually exist, but they just become descriptions of the actions of such a being.
Yeah.
All right, and welcome Adventist Hermes Justin Wilson. How are you? You're coming in right at the end of the show here, but we'll try and stretch things out a little bit if you have something you think you have interesting to say. I'm guessing you fall into the moral realist category. If you're a
yeah,
Seventh-day
quite
Adventist.
naturally. Yeah, quite naturally.
Do you think you could? Do you think it's possible to be an anti-realist and also be a Seventh-day Adventist?
So let me think. Technically, well, you
wouldn't
can
think
be,
that.
but you won't be a consistent one, of course. And that's the thing. That's the real question. Can you be a consistent theist and be a more, I guess, amoral realist or something like that?
Well, that's my difficulty. Is we all have to kind of agree on what we mean when we say something is or isn't moral. Like, what do we mean by the word? And even there is disagreement. You know, well, something is moral because of, you know, it has to do with God's mind or God's will or it's part of God's nature, versus something is good because of some kind of, you know, property of the person or property of the action. It seems like we can't even agree on what we even mean by morality, which to me is always kind of like a sticking point when even starting the conversation. People like to smuggle things into what morality really is. Like, what is morality? Well, it's, you know, bettering society. No, it's about doing what makes God happy or what God wants us to do. It's difficult to even get started at that point.
Yeah, the way I see it is just the blueprint of behavior, how we're supposed to act and exist, you know, by design and plan. And if we start to go outside the lines of the drawing of how we're supposed to be, then that's when we're like without morals, we're out of bounds. That's how I see it. Now, if let's say a Seventh-day Adventist or just Christian in general decides to believe that God doesn't technically have morals for the universe, then how is he supposed to design? Like, what's the design for it? Like, what's the purpose? And
well, for his pleasure. For his pleasure doesn't have to be moral, right? It just has to be for his pleasure.
True. So then, can you go against his pleasure?
You can try. It's not recommended.
Well, yeah, but
the consequences are kind of on the extreme side, by most accounts.
Yeah, but I'm speaking in terms of being an amoral or immoral, I guess, realist or a person who doesn't believe that there's real morals. Can you actually please God?
Well, I think that
I guess.
I think that there's I think that there's kind of like a difference there. Like that, like I said, the example that we're talking about when we're comparing these things is we're acting like questions about like the facts of reality. So like, what is it about these actions that you can use to diagnose anything as right or wrong or anything like that, and that whether or not that these moral propositions that we make are actually I guess the best way to think of it is like, what is it about that a moral fact that makes it true? Okay, and you could be a moral anti-realist and a theist at the same time, I think, because, you know, it's you can still take that there's something kind of innate about the universe that would make these things true or false, but then take a deontological position that, well, we should definitely at least follow what this God says, because it has some other, utility to it, or, because if you don't, you end up in hell. Like there's, you could put other reasons out there. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to appeal to the idea that these propositions can be truth at.
I personally have a tough time reconciling moral anti-realism with theism, at least classical theism, for this reason. God is above all else. As I said, that which none greater can exist. Like, we want to ascribe the highest qualities to God. Anselm said God is that which none greater can exist, but ultimately God is not contingent or dependent upon anything else. It seems if God is just one more thing in the universe, then he's not really greater than anything else. Like, nothing else has any moral worth. Like, what differentiates God? It seems you could obviously say the better thing is, or the greater thing is, that we have moral duties to him, or we have certain obligations towards him. Even if that's a little too strong, even God not being contingent and being necessary in himself, well, that would mean that he's not good for some particular end. Otherwise, he would be subservient to that, or he would be dependent upon that for his property of goodness. Rather, he is good unto himself, and that's why he doesn't need or require anything else for any of his properties or attributes, because he would have already had them. So I think if you get rid of God's goodness, what you don't have really is, a God in a classical theistic sense, but what you really have is a contingent entity, or what you have is an entity who really is in a way like everything else, not any greater, which I think is very limiting.
Yeah. Also, I don't know if it's just me, but like I do have a hard time understanding an anti-realist position with regards to deontology or something like that being the fact, like objective facts, or it's a hard one. But I do agree. I would say, though, to kind of reconcile this a little bit, is I could imagine a deist God that's not personal or anything like that, that would be anti-realist. Like there would be an anti-realist view, because it seems like a lot of times we conflate. Like somebody might say, well, look what God did. Isn't he immoral for that? Like sometimes when we use normative ethics to talk about God, it just seems to me like these are normative human ethics, and that there's should be a delineation between human ethics, right? And then conflating them with a creator of humans. But I guess the last thing, yeah. So I guess the last thing I would say is just that I do think that there could be a deist version of anti-realism where God just created things and just kind of sits back, or maybe he's off doing some other creative thing or something. I mean, but I don't think there's ever could be a consistent, let's say, Christian conception of an anti-realist God.
Yeah, so I agree, and mainly because I'm a deist, and I don't think, I don't think that there's objective.
Oh, okay, cool.
But and I also agree. I think for a Christian it might be untenable in the long term, and for a theistic position anyway.
Yeah, no disagreement here. And for what it's worth, I also agree that anti-realism and deism are compatible with one another.
Yeah, it works out fine.
And
yeah.
I mean, talk about deism. I can't tell the difference between a drunk person and a deist, or like, excuse me, not a deist, a deistic God, because what's the reason that he does anything? And if he has reason, would not that reason be a good reason? And then once you actually have the idea of a good reason, then you have bad, and then you have good and bad. So then therefore there would be technically morals in this universe. So you're back to either a Christian or some kind of like God with morals, which creates a universe with morals, or you have pretty much a drunk God who has no judgment, who's just doing things. He's pretty much the same as nature. has
so-
no mind. He's
Mm,
Right.
I just want to get a clarification on that.
Nope. I'm gonna go.
Go. Oh, okay.
Don't think of a deistic creator like a human or a theistic god. So like the Christian God. That don't give it human traits. Think of a deistic creator from a deistic perspective. Think of it more as like a physicist, a scientist, a mathematician, a philosopher, like all those that kind of
are humans.
being, not a
But those are
dad
humans.
who didn't show up or a dad who didn't teach you what's right and wrong. Like that's not a fair representation of deism. And I would encourage you to try and think of it differently than a human with powers, because that's what a lot
Well-
of Christians do. They tend to think of God as a human being, particularly a male human being, with really, really, really cool powers.
And also, just to step on that, applying attributes to a deistic god might be a mistake to begin with, because from your position, from what I've learned from your position, it could just be an inference to the best explanation. Like this is the deistic god that exists because it is an explanation for the way that the universe works. And so having a specific attributes that you know exist in this deistic god isn't necessary to be a deist. This is coming from an apatheist atheist,
Right.
and I might have that.
And that's correct enough, right? And then the inferences that we can make from the universe and from nature, from a deistic perspective, of course, is that whatever kind of creatures we are, we have within us, all by ourselves, the ability to be moral for all intents and purposes, right? And that's, you don't like to be stabbed because stabbing hurts. You don't like to be betrayed because being betrayed hurts, right? And that gives us a way to exist in a social way, which we have to do because there's so many of us. But like, I'm sure you could imagine another world in a different kind of organism that lives where stabbing's not bad, right? Death is not necessarily viewed as a bad thing or a horrible thing. So then the moral landscape would be different there. And a deistic creator would have created the universe in such a way where that could be the case, right? You're not left with this rigid morality that must apply under all circumstances and all living beings.
True, I hear you, but I was only talking about the principle of good reason versus bad, whether it's a good reason for this alien planet or a bad reason for that alien planet. I'm just thinking there has to be reasons, and you have to decide whether reasons by definition is good or bad. Like, and if you have a god or a deistic god that's doing anything, he has reasons. If he has no reason, then he's no different than nature.
I'm not a deist, but could I take a crack at this, or should I just remain silent?
You got how hesitant Max is. He's like, I think I have answers
You go,
for
Max.
this.
You go.
Okay, thank you. I just don't want to step on your toes here. Okay, so why does any being will anything? Like, why does God freely will to create creation rather than not? If one says for some particular reason, then, well, it seems that reason determines it, and so on and so forth. The way I think of free will is if you have two options and you choose between one of them, well, there doesn't really need to be any further reason. That's what free will is. It's the ability to choose between a multiplicity of options. Like, I don't think God, as I understand him, needs any reason to create in Christianity. So I don't really see a reason why to extend this objection to the deist.
Well, okay, so just like nature doesn't need a reason to do anything.
Nature doesn't
does it.
No, nature doesn't deliberate between options. That's what a will does. It deliberates between options. Nature just is deterministic.
Yeah, so then what's the difference between this deist God and, like, how do you know whether he's looking at any option by what measure, good or bad, by, greater than, less than?
Okay, it's like the question, why
Well,
does
it's actually a pretty good question. What if a deist god is also a product of some evolution in some other type of reality or some other universe?
Right. So the way I see it is, it's kind of like the question, why does heat things? Like, that's just what he does. Why does someone's free will choose between options. Well, that's just what free will is. Like, it's the ability to choose between a multiplicity of options. You could go back ad infinitum, but I don't really think you need to. That's just what free will is. It's the ability to choose between a multiplicity of options. Nature doesn't choose between options. Nature has a set of laws that it slavishly obeys.
I like
Yeah,
it, Matt.
so I see both sides a little bit, and I hate to be the one that always splits up. Like, I see a point on both sides, but like, I think Justin's right about, there is a way. I think he's correct. I would just say though, whenever I say that there could be a deist position that entails anti-realism, I would just say by that I mean that I can conceive of a possible deist position in which there is no so like, for example, let's say, using an anthropomorphic example, like, let's say that that this deist god decided, you know what, I'm gonna create this certain universe and see what unfolds. The same way I might make a video game. All right, so let's say I create a video game and I step away from it and I go to do something different, and just to see what unfolds. I'm not necessarily put these moral, ethical facts on these people or this situation. I'm just want to see what unfolds, right? In that sense, maybe that's not even a feasible world, but I can see how it could be possible. And then the second point where I might say that Justin has a point here is that it does make sense to me what he's saying. I think he has an interesting point, because I use that point sometimes when people say, well, hang on, but why did God do this or that? Couldn't he have done something different, or whatever the case? And I like to say that, like, well, could you know what good is without there being bad, for example? And some people will say, well, yeah, you could. And I say, well, if good is the norm, then how do you know that something's bad? And they're typically hard pressed to come up with an explanation. So you might say that, like, well, God did this certain thing, right? He could have done something where he didn't have an evil consequence or some bad consequence that came out of it. And I go, well, so you're saying that he would have done a good thing that had no conception of bad things. And in that way, I see what he means by that. But I'm just saying that I can conceive of a possible world where a deist God creates something, but doesn't have some type of objective facts, or doesn't hold to a realist position. Maybe that'll kind of clear the air a little bit.
I hear what you're saying. I mean, I just still, in my head, I see like a drunk scientist who is just like experimenting with things, like you were just saying, just to see how it comes out. And of course, he didn't determine what's right and wrong. He's just letting it happen for his entertainment. But then, even at his entertainment, it's in some way a good thing to him, and that will be the ultimate good. And what's boring would be the ultimate evil. So it seems like gravity falls back down to, I guess, moral realism in my mind. And with that, if you put God, period, in any universe, in any scenario, and if there is no moral realism, then there is no God. That's just how my brain is just falling in place. Like, everything is making sense in my head. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. But I mean, I do think that, like I say, I'm just thinking of something that I can conceive of that would meet both of those criteria. So maybe both those criterion. Maybe that's not a point to stick on. I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe Max wants to say something, or Monty, or somebody. But I can see. I guess I can see both points. But I do think there's a possible world where that could exist.
True. Maybe. I assume that if that world does exist, then the definitions would have to change. Yeah.
I'm just saying, I don't see anything wrong with the drunk, hey, hold my beer, deistic universe.
It would explain the existence of beer. Sorry.
True. But yeah, I mean, yeah, and I just say drunk because it just means like the more drunk you are, the lack of judgment you have, and that's what just being drunk is. And if you are completely drunk, if there is in reality complete drunkenness, then you technically have no reason, and you're just the same as a rock. You're not even thinking.
But aren't you just kind of like projecting like what you'd expect God's characteristics onto a deistic God? I mean, there's so many different brands of it that, I mean, who knows?
Well, I mean, is what I'm saying making sense? I'm not saying he has to be this way. I'm just saying this is what it like leads to. If you
maybe
have no.
I'm sorry. Maybe I can add one more thing here. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go here in a second. But Justin, are you considering that this deist God is some type of all-powerful being, like with all the omni properties that the God that we would worship has? Are you considering that?
Well, sure. What defines him God, and what makes him different from us?
Yeah, so I think maybe that's the problem, because maybe you could make a good argument that, well, if this God, let's say, is all powerful, right, or whatever, to have some of these omni properties, that wouldn't be possible for that God to create a universe without moral facts, or without the case of moral realism being true. So I maybe you could see there, but I don't think deists would consider God, and maybe you would just distinguish and say, well, that's a little g God. That's not what we call big G God, the creator of all things, right? It could be like a Spinoza's God, where panentheism or something, where God is the universe, but is more than the universe, right? Is nature, but is more than nature, or something like that, where God isn't necessarily a free-willed being, but as Spinoza put it, neither are we free to make choices or do anything, but neither is God. And so but I guess you could just say, well, that's a little g God. I don't consider that to be the creator God like I think of. And that makes sense, but I think that might be where the mix-up lies.
Yeah, I mean, sure. It's just that my thing is just about reason. If you have no reason, then can you be God? Like in any sense?
Well, I think so. I want to address a couple of things. I mean, I'm going to try and just address a couple of things.
Good thing we got a deist here.
I don't know a lot of deists that would posit like an omnibenevolent, omnipresent, all-powerful. Like that's a very theistic way of describing it.
Well, let's leave that part out. I don't really care about the omni stuff. Just reason.
Right, and then
can you have a God without reason?
That's another theistic thing, right? That's a habit of mind that you're used to because you must be a theist, which is okay. But thinking about a deistic creator, that's not something that we necessarily have. Like we don't have a book where God's like, I did this because like that's just not a thing that we have. Nor is it a thing that we're actually very interested in. And I don't know the reasons why a creator created. I just think that the evidence suggests that this is a creation, right? And then I kind of live my life like that. The reasons are just irrelevant to most deists. Why a God created, or why a creator created, or why a set of creators created, or why we're an accidental science experiment from the 7th grade God. We don't know. So you have, it seems like you have value on something that a deist might not, and that might be where you're a little dissatisfied with some of the answers. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it helps to know what your concerns are. Like you don't concern yourself about the reasons. Right. He just does. Okay, but right. Then
I don't know
what's the definition?
Know what this creator's reasons are, other than looking at the observable world, the observable universe, and I only can see a very small, tiny little piece of that. So it would be, one, it would be a huge leap, and it's more likely to be what I want, right? Because we're very skilled at agreeing with what we think. And then I don't know what purpose it would serve, right? What good from a deist perspective, I don't know what good it would do for me to know why the creator created.
Well, of course, you can know what's the purpose it serves, because then it may lead to morals, or a purpose in your life. But
well, I think that we already have morals, right? Like, I don't think that there's no morals. So I don't need to know the reason why the creator created to know that there are morals and what they are.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So, okay, so to a deist, define God, period. Does it just means creator and nothing else? Doesn't mean supreme, it just means creator.
Right. Or creators.
Yeah, it could be a panel of creators.
Yeah, there could be 7.
So maybe this could help. Like, Justin, you know how when a presuppositionalist talks to an atheist and they go, because you're wondering about the reason, right? So, like, you know how they go, well, if your worldview is correct, there is nothing to found reason in, and thus there is no reason. Like, it's just you imply our conception of reason on your worldview, right? In that same way, you could say, well, if a deist God is the case, then it might not follow necessarily that there is this type of reason like we think of, right? So that's all I'm saying is, like, even if most deists think that there are objective morals, or say some do, probably most, but I just think there is a possibility of a world where there is some type of necessary being deist that, let's say, is driven by nature, that has that their will is not free, that it's, some type of mechanistic God that decides that creates based on some type of natural thing. I'm not sure, but you get where I'm coming from with that. Like, you can see how it's logically possible, even if it's not feasible, right?
I just want to say something real quick. Like, I don't think it's fair to say, like, a deistic God is a drunken God, a theological God. I think that's kind of throwing shade. Wouldn't it just be a God that's not in a box, a God that doesn't have dogma attached to it? And I would challenge any Christian who says they think that they know exactly who God is. Whenever I get a Christian in the room and we talk about the characteristics of God, that always moves to some indecipherable thing. God is love. Well, not our kind of love. God is just, but not our kind of just. God is wrathful and has, these kind of characters, but not our kind of characters. And then all of a sudden I'll see a fallback to skeptical theism, and they'll be like, well, who are we to judge God anyway? Well, you don't even know God then, because these words are meaningless. These are meaningless words. They mean nothing. Yeah. So, like, when a theist asserts they know who God is and everything that they know about God, like I find that very curious, because I find that they'll fall back as soon as you start talking about what these characteristics mean, who God really is.
Right, but it's like describing something in nature, right? It's like, well, we can describe what gravity does, but then you go, well, what is gravity? And like, what is one graviton? How could I know that? Like, I don't know what one graviton actually exists of, or like, I don't know, but I can describe what gravity does. And so similarly, I would, a Christian might say something like, well, listen, God, like, if I created a video game and I set certain rules that are objectives, and the person that, and I hate that I'm going to have to go, like, as soon as I pronounce this, but like, but in the same way, the characters in the video game, they can go like, what are the objectives? But like, to go, well, it doesn't make sense that these are the objectives, or like, to question them in that deeper sense. I don't know. I don't know if it's feasible to understand it in that way, if that makes sense at all.
It made sense to me. I mean, basically, there's always levels to understanding anything. So of course you could say you understand gravity, but not every single aspect that gravity has to the, the deepest point of the mystery. But yeah, a Christian, just like how a baby or a child could look up to his parents and say, oh, my dad does this, but they don't quite understand why they do everything at every single level, because they haven't fully matured to understand every single point. So I can understand a Christian who says that to a degree, not like a Calvinist who doesn't like you questioning them at every point. But when it comes to deist God, back to what I was trying to get at is, yeah, I mean, if you don't define him as supreme, if you don't define him as just any attribute that's just make a God, then yeah, like how can you assume he created anything? I just like if the universe has reason behind it, then would not the fingerprints of reason prove that he has reason? You see what I'm saying? Like if I build a computer, would not the computer itself prove that the person who made it had a reason?
Well, I mean, this is starting to get into like a little bit more of a deeper topic. There is the idea, like, so when we talk about like reason or logic or tools of intelligibility or any of these things that we attribute these to our universe as if it's some type of miraculous thing. But for example, something like logic, logic could exist, as a tool of reason or a tool of intelligibility. It could be something that doesn't just describe our world, but it actually would describe any possible world. So it becomes unmiraculous at that point in time that we live in this universe that we can have this type of reason, because all possible worlds could be described in this way.
All right. Well,
Yeah, so-
we're out of time. We've actually gone a half hour over where we were planning to. Clearly, this is not a topic we're going to solve overnight or probably solve ever. It's one of those things.
Well, we would be the first. Like at this point in time. That's why I think it's better as a discussion than a debate.
Yeah, it seems like in the end, though, a lot of positions are somewhat intractable. But we'll see. We'll probably talk about this more next week. Same topic, new panel. Any final words for anyone here? They want to? There we go.
Funk music.
I'm busy drinking because my drunken deist god demands it.
Oh, well, on that note, cheers. And I'm going to get myself a beer. Thank you all for watching. This has been the Magic Sandwich Show. Thanks to our producer and anyone who donated out in live chat. We greatly appreciate it. See you all next week.